welcome to today's lecture. Today, this is lecture 7. It's actually the 8th lecture because we turned lecture 6 into 2 parts. And today, we're going to be talking about the oral law. This is a very, very, very important lecture having to do with really the fundamentals of understanding the Jewish law and the Jewish Torah. So, the Torah was given together, written and oral law together. This is the Jewish position. And we really have to understand the divine instructions that accompanied the written Torah at Mount Sinai. So the way it's viewed in Judaism is that these are two inseparable halves of one whole. As we'll see, as we're starting to go through the evidence here, is that it's completely impossible for there to be a written law without this oral teaching for many, many reasons. We're going to go through and explain why. What Judaism teaches is that at Mount Sinai, and again, all the evidence for the written Torah and much of the oral was already presented in the previous 6 lectures. But it's the Jewish contention that the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, along with these 5 books that were given together at Mount Sinai, the oral law that provides specific instructions for implementing these commandments were given at the same time as well. So this lecture and this chapter also in the book explores the purpose, the nature, and the transmission of the oral law and some common questions that arise about the oral law and its authenticity. So first and foremost, we have to understand that there is a universal need for oral instruction. This is not something that is unique to Judaism. And again, I know some of you guys here are new, so anybody who has a question, you can write it here in the chat, or you can do the hand raise thing, or unmute yourself and pop in if you need to. We are open for asking questions so long as that they are on topic. So if anybody has a question that's on topic, feel free to interrupt and ask. So as I was stating, there is a universal need for oral instruction with everything. Any written document, whether it's secular, whether it's religious, there is an oral teaching needed in order to understand that. Think, for example, even this PowerPoint presentation that you're looking at some point in time, every one of us here was instructed in what the characters are of the English alphabet, right? We were taught which sounds correspond to which letters. So you're able to read what's here on the screen, right? Only through some type of oral instruction that precedes what we're learning now are we able to decipher these letters. Imagine, for example, that you were the last person left on planet Earth, and all you had in front of you was the Chinese characters, the Chinese alphabet. That's all you had. You didn't have anything else to explain to you what these characters are. If this was the case, even 1,000,000 years wouldn't be enough to learn Chinese. Because at some point in time, you need some type of preliminary instruction in order to understand what these characters are, in order for you to decipher them. So this is really not an idea that's unique to Judaism, having to have some kind of preliminary oral instruction in order to understand what comes after. Now, why really is there such skepticism about the oral law? You know, most people, a lot of people, most of the planet even, especially if we're going to consider Christians and Muslims that accept the 5 books of Moses and accept the historical validity of the revelation at Sinai, even when we count all these people together, there's a very, very broad consensus about the written law, about the Torah being given at Mount Sinai, about the book of Genesis, about the book of Exodus, right? These are things that are taught in schools all over the world. Many religions incorporate from it. So there isn't a very big group of people. I mean, there are people that say, oh no, human beings wrote this. But overall, if we look at the world, most people accept the written Torah, even across multiple religions. But when it comes to the oral law, we see that even within Judaism itself, there is a lot of people that are skeptics and tend to state things that the rabbis added things, they invented things. The Torah doesn't actually say that. Why are you doing these commandments this way? This is interpretation, and so on. So we see that there is a very, very big um, skepticism regarding the oral law. And I think it's interesting because it's not for lack of evidence. Whoever has been here since the beginning and remembers the lectures three, four, five, many of the evidence provided for the authenticity of the Torah in these previous lectures actually comes from the oral law. If you recall almost the entire lecture about the things that Chazal knew about nature, about the fish in the sea, about the animals, about the lunar cycle, almost all of this evidence actually comes from the oral law. So it's not that there's a lack of evidence. So we're going to have to ask the question, why is it that there is such a opposition to the oral law? And in my experience, what I've seen, at least among the Jewish community, because within the Jewish community, there's a lot of traditional people that will say, they see a Torah and they'll kiss the Torah, and we believe in the Torah, and Moses gave the Torah. But the moment you talk to them about the details of the Sabbath laws, they say, oh, no, 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 no. Rabbis added this, they made this up, they did all this, right? So what is really happening here? So what I've seen from my experience is that the oral law which is actually the bulk of the Torah, as we will see, is much more specific and much more difficult to live by and implement. And that is where we really start getting a lot of the pushback, because the oral law, the written Torah, is very general and broad. It tells you very, very universal things like don't kill and don't steal. And that's not something that a rational person is going to argue about. And they're going to say, look, I'm a person of values. I'm a person of ethics. I don't kill. I don't steal, right? It's very easy to make these proclamations. But once you start getting into the specifics of what does stealing really mean, what is allowed, what isn't allowed, what's allowed on the Sabbath, what isn't allowed on the Sabbath, what are you allowed to eat, what are you not allowed to eat, what are all these different very, very specific commandments. And it's the same thing for Noahides. People seem to think that the seven Noahide laws, when I talk to Noahides a lot of time, people that aren't Noahides yet, they say, look, I'm already a Noahide. There's only seven commandments, right? I don't eat meat from live animals. There's a court system. I don't commit adultery. I don't kill. I don't steal. I'm a Noahide. Guess what, guys? You see this book here? See how thick this book is? This is the tip of the iceberg of what the seven Noahide commandments become once you read them together with the oral law. Because to tell somebody, and this book actually is highly recommended for any Noahide, it's actually recommended also for any Jewish person. Very, very important. This is a work by Rabbi Moshe Weiner called The Divine Code, which goes into great detail what the seven Noahide commandments actually mean when you get down to the specifics. And we'll see that even don't kill and don't steal, without getting into specifics, has very, very little meaning. It's the same thing in law, right? And just because you have a category of prohibition that you are or aren't allowed to do something doesn't mean that it's clear for day-to-day people to follow. The devil's in the details, as they say. So the oral law is really the bulk of the Torah, and it's really the binding nature. It's these specific instructions that make people's life more difficult, because it's not just proclamations of I'm good, I'm bad, and then I can kind of interpret things how I want. The oral law sets forth very specific standards of how every commandment is to be performed, the details of every commandment. And this binding nature, from my experience, is really what is at the heart of people's opposition to the oral law, not from lack of evidence. So let's get into some more specific examples, and we'll start by, as we normally do, because my background is in law, and I like to draw on a lot of analogies and examples from the legal system, because that's things that people understand from day-to-day world. We see that even in our modern societies, that the power always lies in the details. Let's take for example, here in Israel, we have healthcare laws, right? There's a universal healthcare law here. And the Knesset, which is the legislative body in Israel, right? Similar to Congress in the United States. They drafted the general healthcare laws that state, what every citizen is entitled to. Now, when you take just this very, very broad healthcare law, you really, really can't get to much and you really don't understand much because the individual services and medicines that are covered and provided, all these things are determined by these small committees of professionals, and they're not elected, people that are not elected, these little committees, and they decide the specifics of what's going to be inside what's called salabriut, what's inside the basket of what are the different rights that people have under this law. So, although you have these general proclamations by the Israeli Knesset, by the Congress, of everybody's entitled to certain things, once you come to your doctor or you're coming to your insurance or your provider to get what you're entitled to, you're going to find out that the reality is very, very different than what is stated in these grand proclamations because it's all in the details. You have a small group of unelected committees, and they decide what the specific regulations are. And here is where we have the actual control comes in the specifics of what you are going to be entitled to and what you're not going to be entitled to. The more you specify something, the less open to interpretation it becomes. That's why good lawyers, sometimes people think we're being getting too much into detail, right? When you come to a lawyer and you ask for a contract and you always say, oh, just make it kind of this is what I'm looking for. And the lawyer starts getting into all sorts of details and boilerplate language. Why? Because the more specific you make something, the less open it becomes to interpretation, and then the less likely you're going to have problems understanding it later. Now, this principle applies equally to secular law and the relationship between the written and the oral law. Without specific instruction, even the clearest commandments become very, very vague and unenforceable. So, let's take an example, the prohibition against stealing. Okay? In multiple places in the Torah, we're commanded not to steal. Most of us agree armed robbery is classified as stealing. I don't know somebody who's going to argue with that. Armed robbery, I think across the board, most people are going to say, yep, that's stealing. But what about when we get into other more vague scenarios? What if you're an employee and while you're working and you're still doing your job for the most part, but your attention isn't 100% focused because you're on the phone talking to your friend about whatever else you want to talk about, dealing with your own issues while at work, but you're being paid hourly to give your full focus and attention. Is this considered stealing or not? What about using office supplies for personal projects that belong to the office? I mean, when something it's not worth much, it's just a stapler. Do we know if I ask permission, would my boss care or not? I mean, is it that big a deal? Is it considered that I'm stealing or not stealing? What about from the government? What about if I pad my expenses a bit, so then my income is a little less high and then I'm going to pay less taxes? Am I allowed to pad expenses to pay less taxes, or is that considered that I'm stealing from the government? The government isn't technically a person. Am I allowed to, where in the Torah or in any other body of law does it say that I'm not allowed to pad my expenses to pay less money? Maybe I don't agree with what the government is using the money for. Maybe they're taking my taxes and they're giving it to all sorts of programs that are against my belief system. Why should I have to contribute and pay for all sorts of things that I think are not legitimate? So I'm padding my expense reports so I pay less taxes. Is this considered stealing? Guess what? If you look in the written Torah, you're not going to find the answer to any of these questions because the Torah just tells you don't steal. But what does that mean? What is the standard? Is it only from a person? Is it only from a certain person? What about stealing from somebody who stole something? What if somebody is a crook and he went and robbed a bank? He stole money from the bank. Am I allowed to walk in this house and steal $1,000 from him? I mean, it's not really his money. So, as you see, even something that is universally acknowledged as something that's, across the board, you shouldn't steal, it doesn't really mean much if we don't have specifics. What about Murder. Most people agree that just shooting somebody at point blank because he made you angry is murder. What about abortion? What about, I mean, even within society, you'll have some people that'll tell you abortion's murder. Someone else will say, nope, baby hasn't been born yet. It's the woman's body. She has autonomy over her body. And then other people will tell you, look, it depends on how far along the pregnancy is, right? Maybe in the first month or two, it's not really considered a baby. Maybe at 6 months it is. Bottom line is, it's chaos. All of these so-called values that have been set forth, it's complete chaos because as you see in our modern society, we can't agree on much. And these are just words. They're empty words that don't mean anything without specifics. And every society in any point in the world can twist them to fit their personal bias. And this is really a callback to our very, very first lecture. Our very first lecture in this series, and the first chapter of this book, is entitled Conveniently Righteous. And what that means is that human beings have a personal bias to do what's comfortable for them. And the moment things aren't specific, human beings are going to interpret, and not just human beings, societies are going to interpret laws to fit whatever is most convenient for that society at that point in time. So specifics is very, very important. And without specifics, we really have nothing. So now, these were issues that, I mean, again, just to drive the point home, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think I've made the point with laws like killing and stealing. But if things that are supposed to be universally accepted, such as don't kill and don't steal, have these types of problems in order to really understand them, in order to have a definitive value system, how much more complicated is it going to get once we try to extrapolate from the Torah laws regarding real estate, property, boundaries, disputes between neighbors, rental agreements, inheritance rights? What about torts and damages? Family law, divorce, marriage contracts, child support. Where in the Torah are you going to find all these specific laws? Guess what? You're not going to find it. Now, it follows that if God, the creator of the universe, came to people at Mount Sinai and said, this is the divine code. These are the laws that you need to keep. This is your path forward. This is the reason I created the world, for you guys to keep these laws. It makes sense that he's going to give us some pretty clear instructions. So where do we find this within the Torah? Where do we find specific financial obligations and specific torts and specific laws about real estate? You're not going to find very many specifics in the written law. So how do we how do we know? Let's get to really to the bottom line. How do we know that a oral law was provided along with the written law? And before I get into the specific examples of the evidence for the oral law, I want to first explain why this oral law was not just all written down. Because someone can say, look, if God wants to give us specifics, just write the written law, make it 5,000 pages long, and just write the very specific details of everything, right? So what happened? When was this written down? Where do we find this oral law today? So initially, and we're going to explain a bit later how this works and where the oral law, why it wasn't written down initially and why it was kept oral. Initially, to write the oral law was forbidden. In Judaism, there was a specific prohibition against writing it down, and I'm going to get into why that was. However, what happened is about 2,000 years ago, after the destruction of the Second Temple, there was a very, very, very difficult time in Jewish history. Most of the rabbinical scholars were being murdered. They were in hiding. There was not much left of Judaism at that time after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. At that time, the oral law was in a state where it was in danger of being forgotten. In order to save it from extinction, because he had no other choice, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who was the head of the rabbinical ordinance at that time, he traveled around in Israel and compiled all of the oral law that was being taught in the yeshivas and in the academies of that time. He canonized all of the oral law that was being taught, that was continuously being taught from the time of Mount Sinai, orally and transmitted from generation to generation. he compiled it into 6 books called the Mishnah. These 6 books are very, 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 very brief. Much like the written law, it's very hard today to extrapolate laws just from the Mishnah itself. It was really a very shortened version that summarized all of the oral law. Now, what happened is that not too long after that, it already became, and this is actually one of the reasons we see why the oral law why God didn't want the oral law written down in the first place. Because the moment it was written down, this created an issue of it being difficult to understand in different interpretations. And a few hundred years later, the Gemara that was compiled, which is essentially question and answer format of discussions and debate regarding the Mishnah. The Mishnah is, for example, gives you if we're talking about damages, the Mishnah will give us what are the categories of damagers, and if somebody commits one kind of tort against the other, how much is he liable to pay? And it's very, very brief. The Gemara will then come and analyze this Mishnah through comparing it to other Mishnahs, through other traditions, and through logic, and through different scriptural exegesis that it let in order to come down to what the bottom line law is. The Gemara and the Mishnah together are called the Talmud. Now, anybody who sits and learns Talmud, this is a very, very, very difficult, in-depth analysis. Every single possible scenario is examined in every issue. That's really what the bulk of studying Torah is. When you hear Jewish people talk about Torah study, the bulk of Torah study really comes from this in-depth analysis of the Talmud. The way the Talmud is studied is not just by reading by yourself. Somebody sitting at home reading the Talmud by himself, that's not the way Torah is supposed to be studied. It is studied in groups, and usually once two people understand enough how to learn, they learn together. Otherwise, it's in a bit smaller groups, but it's in a discussion where you're constantly engaged with the teacher, asking questions and understanding the depth of every issue. For example, now, you know what? Let's hold off on this example because I want to get more into the evidence and I'm going to actually come back to this example. I don't want to overwhelm you guys with Talmudic examples, but this is just so you understand. When we say today the oral law, where is the oral law found? The oral law is found in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, which together is called the Talmud. And this is the bulk of the law that was given together at Mount Sinai with the written Torah. Now, the question that we really need to ask, we really need to first prove that this bulk of evidence, that this bulk of law was given along with the written Torah. So, question number 1, what evidence exists that God gave an oral law? So, as we said, it's not for lack of evidence that people usually have an issue with this, but once we start looking at it into detail, you can see that it's impossible that an oral law does not exist, and you can see that from the written law itself. So, simple logic. First and foremost, the written law actually states in Leviticus, these are the laws and ordinances and the Torahs, in Hebrew, the Torahs in plural, which God gave to the children of Israel through the hand of Moses. So first and foremost, you have a site where the Torah talks about the Torahs, and this is what we understand to be the Torah, the written and the oral law. Now, the first issue is punctuation. If I go back to this previous, you see this Torah scroll, this picture that you guys see up here. A Torah scroll is written without punctuation. There is no punctuation within the Hebrew Torah. Now, when we start reading through the Torah, there are many words in Hebrew that could have the same meaning spelled identically, but with different punctuation. As you see at the bottom, if you guys see these Hebrew words written at the bottom that I added here to this PowerPoint slide, these two words are chalav and chelev. Chalav means milk, and chelev is a type of animal fat. These are the exact same letters. And even when you read it within the context of a sentence, you have absolutely no way of knowing when if it says, thou shalt not eat chelev, you have no idea if it says thou shalt not eat milk or thou shalt not eat animal fat. It's exactly the same letters, spelled exactly the same way, and in the same context, it could mean either one. Meaning that the only way we even know how to read the written Torah is because we have an oral tradition of how it is punctuated. I'll give you guys another example. In the Torah, when we talk about purity laws, there are times of the month where a man and a woman are allowed to be together. A husband and wife are allowed to be together. There's specific laws about when a woman is pure and when she's impure after she's been through her menstrual cycle. There's also specific laws about after a woman gives birth, how long she needs to wait before she can go to a mikveh, which is a ritual bath, to become pure, and then she's allowed again to commence marital relations with her husband. In the Torah, the Torah states specifically that when a woman gives birth to a female baby, she is impure, and then the word is shvu'aim. Now, this word shvu'aim can be spelled with or without a vav. In the Torah, it's spelled without. It's spelled without a vav, meaning that same exact word, depending on how you punctuate it, can mean 2 weeks or it could mean 70. It could be read shiv'im, and it could also be read shvu'aim. It's the same letters in the same context. Without an oral tradition, you have absolutely no way on planet Earth to know whether the Torah means 70 or 2 weeks, because it's exactly the same word. Not only that, when you say the word 70, this could be 70 seconds, this could be 70 days, this could be 70 months, this could be 70 years, right? It just says 70. We know through oral tradition how to correctly read the written law and how it is to be punctuated. So everybody knows that what it's written there is shvu'aim, meaning it is 2 weeks. Now, anybody who wants to say, look, I accept the written Torah as the word of God, and I want to live only by the written Torah, and the rabbis interpreted all sorts of things how they wanted, and I don't believe in the oral law. So this person now, after his wife gives birth to a female baby, he may not be able, according to his own interpretation, to now live with his wife or have marital intimacy with her for what? 70 days? 70 years? I mean, I guess that depends on the nature of the relationship. We'll leave that up to his interpretation. The point is that I could sit here for 5 hours and bore you all to death with hundreds more examples of how the written law cannot even be read without the oral law. We have no idea how to even read its punctuation. So first and foremost, there needs to be an oral tradition on how to even read it. Now, let's say we got past the problem of not knowing how to read something, right? Let's say that was clear. Let's look at all these commandments that we've been given that the Torah specifically states are very, very important to perform. Circumcision, which everybody in the world knows about circumcision, and everybody knows where circumcision is performed, right? The only place in the Torah that talks about circumcision states in Genesis, you shall remove the extra flesh. Period. End of sentence. That's all it says. Umaltem et basar olatchem. You shall remove the extra flesh. It does not say where this extra flesh is. How do all the Jews in the world, and now many non-Jews all over the world, know where circumcision is performed? It does not say in the Torah a single word about it. Extra flesh could be on your ear. It could be in this area between your fingers. There's lots of different places that someone can have extra flesh. But somehow everybody knows and agrees that the extra flesh is in the circumcision where the circumcision occurs. But the Torah, written Torah, doesn't say where to do it. The Torah tells the Jews to build a sukkah but the Torah doesn't tell us what a sukkah is. We have a holiday where we have to build a sukkah and live in it for 7 days. But the Torah doesn't tell us what a sukkah is. To fill in which are the things that the Jews bind on their hand and on their head. I'm sure you guys have seen tefillin pictures of it. We're commanded to put on tefillin every day. You know what the Torah says about tefillin? You shall bind them as a sign on your arm and on your head. No other specifics are provided. So what are we supposed to bind? What's supposed to be written on them? What color are they supposed to be? Nothing. There's literally no other further instructions in the written law regarding what tefillin are. Now, let's just do an exercise in logic, right? The Torah, whoever reads through the five books of Moses knows how many times and how important all these different commandments that were given and how the Jews are commanded that these are commandments for all their generations and all their dwelling places. And be careful lest you forget these commandments over and over again. Does it make sense that God would give all of these very, very important commandments without providing any details whatsoever on how to implement them? Especially since the Torah even tells the Jews that if they don't perform these commandments, there's very severe consequences for not performing these commandments. So, I mean, even for example, if I had a child, imagine me as a father telling my son that he has to do something really, really important, but then I don't give him any instructions on how to do it. And then I tell him, look, if you don't do this very, very important task, you're going to be severely punished. Could it be that a father is going to put something like that on his child that's not going to give him specifics on how to perform? It doesn't make any sense. So the examples here go on and on and on because there really is not a single commandment that can be performed from the Torah without the oral law. Tzitzit, right? The things that we wear on our clothes, tzitzit. The only thing that it says you see every observant Jew in the world wears these. How do they know how they're made? The Torah, all it says, and says you shall make them fringes on your garments, and doesn't tell you the specifics how to make them. The kosher slaughter of animals, the only instruction written, and this is actually maybe one of the biggest pieces of evidence, the Torah commands, you shall prepare the kosher slaughter, quote, as I have commanded, end quote. That's all it says in the Torah. The Torah does not give us any more details. Now, if you go and you open a Jewish halacha book of how a kosher slaughter needs to be performed, I can fill this room behind me with books and books and books and books of all the details of a kosher slaughter. The only instruction you have in the written law is to do it as I have commanded. This also infers that it's been commandment. The Torah states that the Sabbath is one of the most important commandments, and it is reiterated to the Jewish people more times than any other commandment in the Torah. The Torah's punishment for violating the Sabbath is the death penalty. Now, is it possible that God prescribes the death penalty, as we see that happened in the book of Leviticus? There is a story of a man in the desert who went out and gathered firewood during the Sabbath, and he was put to death. Is it possible that God says to observe the Sabbath decrees, but does not tell us how to keep the Sabbath? And then says, look, and if you violate it, the punishment is death, but doesn't give us any type of details. So as we see just from these examples, it is completely impossible for there to be a written law without the accompanying oral instruction. So now that we've been through this, the question really becomes, why do it this way? If this is all so important, why should we leave it to this oral thing that gets transferred and maybe people will forget, maybe people will say it differently, maybe it'll get lost? Why does God leave it up to this, what seems to be inefficient manner of transfer? Because if you have all these laws regarding the 39 things that are prohibited on the Sabbath, regarding the details of building a sukkah and the kosher slaughter, God doesn't have a lack of a paper and pen, right? He can write the whole thing out very, very specifically, and then we'll have to learn that. Why do it this way? So, to understand this better and the way this works and why it's done this way, I want to do it through the note-taking analogy. So, just like we're in this lecture right now, if somebody were to be taking notes right at home and just jotting down, and when somebody's taking notes, because I talk pretty fast, you don't have time to write down every single thing that I'm saying. So you're going to write down as a note taker very specific keywords that are there to jog your memory, right? As you're going through, right? And by the way, you don't need to take notes because I'm going to provide, you guys get provided this PDF at the end of the lecture. It's on the website. Every lecture that we've given, you're able to go through and see these PowerPoints. And even these PowerPoints that are pretty detailed still don't cover everything that I've said. But imagine you're sitting in the class, right? You're in university or you're in high school, and the lecture is just going on, talking away, and you're taking notes, right? If somebody else were to read your notes afterward without being physically present in the lecture, how beneficial would these notes be to them, right? Now, let's say even they had nice, clear handwriting, right? Most of the time, people write shorthand things just to jog their memory. Now, when they know, oh, proof and the slaughter, right? You could write a few quick words later because you were at the lecture. When you see those notes, that'll jog your memory. Oh, yeah, Moyal talked about how the Torah says that you shall prepare the kosher slaughter as I have commanded. You didn't have time to write all that out, but it's enough that you write a keyword that'll jog your memory when you read it later. But if somebody wasn't at the lecture and they go and they read your notes, what they're going to be able to decipher from there is going to be minimal and definitely a lot less than you that was physically present at the lecture. So, drawing on this analogy, the written law and the oral law, the way that they work between these. So, the written law is actually the notes. When we see short key phrases like bind them on your arm, do the kosher slaughter, don't forget to keep the Sabbath and observe its commandments. All the laws of finances are written in the written law about how you have to return things that are lost and how you things about regarding stealing and return and what someone that stole has to pay. These are written in the written law, but very, very concisely. But whoever's been at the lecture can understand from seeing these short phrases like you shall bind them on your arms, knows that this is a reference to tefillin or to a sukkah. And the bulk of the law, the main core of Judaism is actually contained in the oral law because these are the specifics of the commandments. And as we said, without the oral law, you can't there isn't a single commandment that you can fulfill in the Torah. People have tried, and that's where we get a lot of confusion from people that have gone off the path of what Judaism is in its original form. So that's one reason. Now, another reason is that the best way, if we actually think about it, people could say, right, we said, why didn't God just write this all down? That's actually not the best way. Because the moment something is written down, it can be interpreted different by people. The same two people with different worldviews, with different backgrounds, with different educations can read the same specific, even if it's a specific document, and they can understand things differently. And it's enough that if all we have is a written document and people are reading and understanding it differently, you're going to have very, very, very different understandings of what the law is. So the reason that God wanted this done in an oral way is that every single generation would have to learn together in front of a teacher. And that is the best way, not to just learn on by yourself, not to learn on a book, is to sit and be able to clarify and ask questions. And that's exactly what happened from the time of the desert. Moses was the first teacher. You guys ever wonder what they do 40 years in the desert? What were they doing wandering 40 years in the desert? Were they just hanging out there? For 40 years, Moses taught every single day all of these very specific rules and commandments. And that's what they did. They asked questions. And then the more advanced students, they became leaders and they would teach on. And that's how the Torah study has become the cornerstone of Judaism till today. You can come into a Jewish study hall in the United States or in Israel. There's a lot more of them. And you can sit and you see students learning from teachers who learned from their teachers, who learned from their teachers back thousands of years, the same laws over and over again. in very, very great detail. That's how you provide a transmission system. Giving a long list of rules is only going to lead to many, many different people doing things differently. Now, when the Jews came back after 2,000 years of exile, how do we know this works? When the Jews came back after 2,000 years of exile, the Jews were all over the world. The Jews were in Europe, they were in Africa, they were in Yemen, all over the place for 2,000 years. Did any Jew come back to Israel in 1948 with pink tefillin? Did anybody come back with bright yellow ones or with different scriptures written inside their tefillin or with a different Torah or with a different interpretation or punctuation of the Torah? We see that the Jews came back with even the Yemenites that were isolated from the rest of the Jews came back with the same exact commandments because the system works. It is a system that forced every generation to orally sit and learn these things in front of a teacher. So that's really the reason, one of the main reasons. Another reason is because God wanted this to remain somewhat of an exclusive club. The moment, now take for example, the written law. Since the written law was written down, the Torah, what have the rest of the nations of the world done with the written law? It's been translated into Greek. It's been translated into every other language on the planet. It's been distorted. It's been taken out of context. Muslims have taken it and interpreted it however they want. Christianity has taken the Hebrew verses of the Torah and in some places completely misrepresented them, and in some places completely mistranslated them, and in some cases it's intentional. For example, the word the virgin will give birth, which is the basis in scripture for the virgin birth. Any child in third grade in Israel, if you let them read the passage, knows that the passage does not say virgin. The Hebrew word for virgin is betulah. There is no place in the Torah where that word means virgin. But in order to fit it into their doctrine, the prophet was translated as a virgin will give birth. There is no basis in any Hebrew translation on any planet that the word alma is translated as a virgin. It just simply doesn't exist. But this is what happened with the written Torah. Because it was readily available to the nations, it was translated, it was distorted, and it was put into its own narrative. The Jews wished to avoid this with the oral law, and that's why they held on to writing it down for as long as possible. That's the second reason. Now, so what's happened essentially, and what really proves this point, is that from the moment the oral law was written in the Mishnah, there have been countless works subsequently written in order to clarify it. Because we said the Gemara is a discussion of understanding the Mishnah. And after that, all of the rabbinical scholars, halachic wise, have come afterwards and to continually clarify, and not just to clarify, to take these different laws and apply them to modern day scenarios. And this is how the Torah study works. And we'll get into that when we arrive at the third question. So, how do we know that rabbis didn't change the law, right? If this is an oral law, right? How do we know that rabbis just simply didn't come along and make up their own laws along the way, right? Not unheard of, not something that is illogical to think maybe somebody added a law, maybe they took one away, maybe they interpreted it in a way that actually changed it from what God originally intended. And this is where we really see where the whole oral part of it and the oral learning and transmission really comes into play. Judaism does not rely on a single source of written material that can be interpreted this way or that. This is a living, breathing document, similar to what the best example I can give you guys is the blockchain. I don't know here who really understands Bitcoin very much, but the very idea of the reason why the Bitcoin technology is supposed to be foolproof. I mean, now they're saying that there's going to be quantum computers that can break apart the blockchain technology. But the idea of the blockchain technology is that one is always verifying the other. And when you have millions of people constantly verifying this chain, it's impossible to fabricate. You don't have a centralized bank that can take away the money or can change the amounts. There isn't one person that's in charge. You have millions of people that are checking each other's math all the time. So this idea of blockchain is supposed to create a scenario where one person or even a group of people can't falsify and change. And you don't need a central government. You don't need a central authority. It is constantly verifying itself. This is actually a very good analogy, even though blockchain is something that is pretty new, technology-wise. But this is kind of how Judaism has been built. This is how the oral law has been built in this way, where everybody is constantly verifying each other's works. And now we really also have to understand how the system here works. For example, the Torah did not tell us, even the oral law didn't tell us 3,300 years ago, you shall not drive your car on the Sabbath, right? There were no cars. The Torah didn't tell you that you're not allowed to turn on your computer or be on your smartphone on the Sabbath, right? These things didn't exist. So how do we know today? Why do observant Jews today not drive a car on the Sabbath, right? So the way this works, the way Torah works, is that at Sinai, in the written and oral law, we received main categories of prohibitions of commandments. For example, from the Sabbath, we received 39 categories of things that are prohibited on the Sabbath. It is now the job of the Jews of every generation to properly apply these commandments to what currently exists. Let's take example fire, right? One of the main prohibitions of the Sabbath is a prohibition against lighting fire. So now the question becomes, as modern technologies develop, what constitutes lighting fire? Is starting a car, is that the same act as lighting a fire? What about electricity? Is electricity fire? What if I turn on an electric oven? What about a phone? Right? What about a light switch? These are all answering these questions is the job of the Torah scholars of every generation. So that's why the Torah is a living, breathing document that is constantly being reapplied to new scenarios. And this is exactly what God wants. This is what the Torah and the oral Torah talks about. He wants this living, breathing extension. And when it comes down to the source, it's the same. There is not much difference. For example, lighting a fire like they used to with rocks or from a candle wick from one to the other, when you get down to it, there's little difference between that and what happens when you ignite a car's ignition system. There's really no difference. So there is no discrepancy among the halachic authorities that when somebody takes the key and turns the ignition and the spark that happens in order to ignite, right, the engine, it's the same exact act as lighting a fire. Now, things get a bit different when we start talking about electricity, electric cars. There's things that are rabbinical prohibitions. I can't get into all the very different specifics of how halacha works, but we have very, very specific categories that have been handed down from generation to generation. And toiling and understanding this living, breathing extension has really been the job of every Jew to learn and understand and teach this. The same thing applies to Noahides. Noahides have a commandment to learn their commandments. It's not enough to just say, I'm a good person and I don't kill and I don't steal, and that's the end of it. Every Gentile of the world has enormous, enormous reward in the world to come from studying his commandments. Why? Because when a person sits and studies his commandments, he is connecting himself spiritually to what the divine wisdom is. When I'm sitting and starting to understand what does this mean to the depth, I am connecting with infinite godly wisdom. And I'm elevating myself above the material and physical world. For example, there is an entire chapter here on euthanasia, right? Is that considered murder? Assisted suicide, right? This is something that dates all the way back. If you go into the Torah, in the book of Samuel, we have a situation where King Saul actually asks a soldier to help him commit suicide before the Philistines capture him. But today we know that euthanasia, if somebody just is suffering and they go and they ask somebody to end their life, this is a very, very serious crime in Torah. If somebody goes and ends someone's life, even if they're suffering, the person who killed himself is liable for murder, and the person who assisted him is liable for murder. But how does that fit in? How does that fit in with what happened with King Saul? So these are things, these are commandments that have to do with murder, which is one of the Noahide prohibitions, which is uh, it is incumbent and commanded to every non-Jew to learn these things into the depth. Why? That's how you're connecting with not what we think makes sense, not what we like, not what we want, with what the divine wisdom is. And this is a very high form of spirituality. People think that spirituality is just to sit with candles and meditate and pray to God. No, 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 no. This is also can be very spiritual. But spirituality is really connecting the logic and connecting and making my thought process subservient, first of all, to understand what the divine logic is. We see that the world is created with immense, immense, immense chokhmah, with amazing intelligence that there is in this creation. This creation is a product of God's divine wisdom, and He's provided us in the written and oral law a small glimpse into His wisdom and to what He believes is moral and immoral. And it's not even about morality. Sometimes it's just about justice, about what's right in monetary issues. There are certain situations where you might not think that you need to pay money back. But the Torah will tell you, you absolutely need to pay. And there are situations where you might feel, you know what? I should give this money back. And the Torah says, no. In this situation, you're not allowed to give the money back to this person because I'm putting aside what I think makes sense and connecting to what the divine wisdom is. Now, what happens? Now, as we asked, how do we know rabbis didn't change anything? We talked about this blockchain analogy, but the Torah in Deuteronomy specifically also says, you shall not deviate from the word that they will tell you, right or left. When there is a discrepancy or there is a disagreement about rabbinical sages, within the rabbinical sages, we have clear instructions on how to proceed forward. For example, the majority decision is binding. So there's many times where within Torah law, you have a dissenting opinion, but in the end, when there's a majority, that's now what the law is, and that's the law that needs to be implemented. Just like today, if the Supreme Court hands down a law, and there was, seven judges that ruled one way and three judges that dissented, you can't say, oh, you know what? I'm going to follow what the dissenting judges' opinions are, right? I'm going to go do in practice in my day-to-day life, I'm going to follow what the dissenting opinion is. No, if it's a criminal issue, you'll be stopped and charged with a crime. And the fact that there's three Supreme Court judges that agree with your interpretation of the law, it's not going to help you. Why? Because the majority rules, and that's what the law of the land is now. It's the same principle with deciphering the oral law. So, moving on to the next, and as we stated, this is very similar to modern legal systems. I don't think I need to really delve into this more, but it's the same idea how in a democratic legal system, you have the legislative branch, right? They write what the laws are, and then the courts interpret those laws consistent with legislative intent. The Torah system is similar. Of course, the Torah system predated this. So we can see that much of the system today is built on these same ideas that were innovative at the time of when the written oral law were being passed from generation to generation. Now, it is impossible for rabbis to invent laws of their own, impossible for them to delete existing ones, because this is all constantly being studied in this blockchain type of environment. And history has shown us that anybody attempting to change the Torah laws has been met with fierce opposition from both sages and the masses. Even slight changes, slight variations are always met with very, 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 very big oppositions. And we see this also with different religions that have branched out from Judaism and attempted to change the laws. How do we know that it wasn't forgotten and then somebody made it up and added it in later? For this, I will refer all of you back to our historical transmission lecture. We did an entire lecture, which is Divine Indications, chapter 6, part 2, where we did the whole analogy of the Holocaust Commemoration Society. And we talked in detail about how the transmission system went from generation to generation to generation. So that really will answer the question about how do we know that things were not a product of a broken telephone situation. This is at least an hour lecture on its own. Anybody who has this question, I refer you to that lecture where we deal in detail of how the Torah system is set up in a way to transfer in a foolproof way from generation to generation, similar to the Holocaust Commemoration Society in our analogy. And the last question that we posed, and that's where I think we're going to stop for today because I could keep going on this topic for a while, but I don't want to overwhelm with information, even though I probably have already overwhelmed. If this is the case and things are so clear and it's been passed from generation to generation, and we have all of these different types of rules of how things are supposed to be, why is it then that we have rabbis that disagree? We have different rabbinical disagreements, and there are certain rulings where you can choose to practice this way or that way. How does that work exactly? How does that fit into what I've been teaching and explaining to this point? So, in order to answer this question, we really need to make the critical distinction about what are they actually arguing about. And all of these disagreements, almost all of them, there's a few minor places where there could be some deviations from this rule, but in general, the disagreement is almost never about what is the law that was given at Mount Sinai. It is how to apply the given law at Mount Sinai. Meaning, you will not find any Torah sage that says that there is 38 instead of 39 prohibitions on the Sabbath, and that you are allowed to light a fire on the Sabbath. You're not going to find an opinion like that. You are going to find a discrepancy between applying that. There are people who believe, there are rabbinical sages in our latter generations that have arrived that the idea that electricity, for example, is not close enough to fire to be considered fire, and it is therefore only a rabbinical prohibition to turn on certain types of electricity like a fluorescent. Fluorescent doesn't work like fire the way those old light bulbs do that have the wires that actually start almost a mini fire inside the light bulb. Fluorescent is based on a chemical reaction. So there are rabbinical disagreements about whether that is considered a Torah prohibition or not. Not because the law in Sinai is not clear. It's because the question of what is a fluorescent and how should we characterize it? That's where the rabbinical disagreement comes in. Should this fluorescent be considered like you're lighting a fire, or is it different enough that where it doesn't count as lighting a fire? And within this, now we have rabbinical ordinances, things that I don't want to get into today, but that's really the nature of the disagreement, is how to apply certain things. Similar to secular courts, you can have different rulings in different courts that apply the Constitution differently, but that doesn't mean that they're arguing about the fact that the Constitution states that there needs to be equality, right? You're supposed to have equality under certain provisions, and one law can rule that this is subject to that and one is not. That's really where it comes in. But as we stated, we have built-in resolution that when it comes down to it, we go after the majority of opinions. And that's really where you're going to have an issue. And that's why people sometimes latch on to this and they say, oh, this rabbi says this rabbi says that. Nobody knows anything. The moment you get into deeper and you start understanding, you see that the level of detail and scrutiny and effort that's been put into this analysis is beyond any type of study that you've seen anywhere in the secular world. Anybody who studies Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's books on halacha is blown away at the intense detail and the thousands of books that he will go through in order to back up a single halachic answer. We're talking about something like a computer mind that's able to look at thousands of different rulings in order to come to something that we now take for granted as simple after he did this work. But the level of detail and specificity is really outstanding. So to sum up today, we have really the unity of the written and oral law. Right? Both were received together at Sinai. They're transmitted orally until the time of the Mishnah when it was written down. and afterwards the Gemara, and afterwards rabbinical commentaries that come to continually elucidate. It's about how to, the different discrepancies are about how to apply the current Torah laws to new situations that are up and coming in the world, new technologies that have been developed. It is continuously studied and throughout history. That's why the Jews have been called Am HaSefer, the nation of the book. That's really what the main purpose of Jews in the world is, to sit and study this round the clock. There is actually a prohibition called bitul Torah. Many people don't know this, but there is a prohibition against wasting time and not learning. Things in an orthodox view of Torah and in a scholarly and Torah thought, there is the idea of wasting your time when you could be studying Torah is a very grievous sin in itself. For somebody who has the ability to sit and connect to the divine wisdom and learn these laws, to sit around watching Netflix in Judaism is a sin in itself, because God did not put us on this planet to waste our time. We're supposed to be doing everything we can to learn in detail, to connect to him, to God, and to teach. And now I'm not saying a person doesn't need a break. I'm not saying a person shouldn't go out with his family and take a walk in nature and enjoy. That's all fine. But when we've come to a society where a person goes to work and comes home, and then in the evening he just wants to, relax and watch a movie and have a drink and listen to music. This is not Torah thought. In Torah thought, you will see that people that are inside the living the Torah life, everything is around study, setting times for study. Even people that work around the clock, they have times in the morning and in the evening dedicated a few hours a day to study, because that's really what brings us closer to God, is understanding what God's judgment is on every issue, and then it becomes part of us.